In this mini lesson, we'll be focusing on Romanticism. If you're a teacher and would like to use this presentation in your classroom, there is a link to it for free in the description and without this voiceover. There's also a link to a few worksheets that you can use to check your students' understanding, and they are free for a minute. The HSC texts that are composed in the Romantic era include the poetry of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Extension 1 for Reimagined worlds, the poetry of John Keats for Advanced Module A, Textual Conversations, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley for Extension 1 in Worlds of Upheaval, and the poetry of William Wordsworth in Extension 1, Intersecting worlds. If you're hoping for a Band 6 in English Advanced or an E4 in English Extension 1, please remember that Module A, Module B and all electives require explicit and nuanced links to context. It would be a good idea to go grab your prescribed text now and pause at each slide and find specific moments in your text where that value or attitude is relevant. Don't worry too much about the dates of the Romantic period. They shift and change. We can be approximate when we're referring to these eras because there's not a specific moment of delineation between one era and the next. Some useful language that will help you have variety in your response rather than sounding repetitive includes words instead of context, such as era, period, epoch, milieu. That just means the social environment, or the zeitgeist, the mood of the times. When referring to how the Romantics were moving away from the period that came before it, you could use phrases such as reaction to, in response to, in opposition to, railing against, moving away from, breaking away from, or their distaste for. The Romantic period was a time of cultural, intellectual and artistic change, particularly in the visual arts, music and literature. Many people use 1798 as its beginning, and that was because that was when Wordsworth and Coleridge published their very famous poetic anthology, Lyrical Ballads, and that it goes up to the end of the 19th century. There is consensus, though, that the peak is around 1800 to 1850, and some people say that it was more or less over by the 1820s. The Romantics were looking at the world in a very new and different way, and they were deeply committed to its ideals. There are, of course, texts that are being written today that still have a Romantic influence, and many of you will identify, I would imagine, with some of the things that they found important. Before we go into too much detail about the Romantic era itself, we'll first look at what came before it. So it was the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. That went from about 1650 to around about 1800. And this was a time in which people were very much interested in the scientific, the rational, the reasoned, the empirical, what could be measured, how to quantify things, and how to use evidence to support claims. It can be useful sometimes when you're trying to show breadth of understanding of context to refer not only to the Romantic period, but the Enlightenment and what came before the Romantic period. So here is an example of how you could do it in one go. In opposition to the Enlightenment's focus on empirical evidence, Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner focuses not on the quantitative impact of the loss of the albatross, but on the emotional burden of transgressing against nature a key concern of the Romantics. So in purple there, you can see reference to the Enlightenment and how things were, and how the new way of seeing things comes in afterwards with the Romantic in the green. Obviously, if you were in an exam, you would need to be making sure that this linked to the question that was asked on the day, and in an explicit way as well. The Romantics were also responding and reacting to the Industrial Revolution. So in broad terms, that was moving from the agricultural to manufacturing, from creating things by hand to machines, and where towns were growing into cities, or people were moving from towns to cities. That meant that there was a real focus on the economy, materialism, obviously a sense that urbanisation was engulfing everything. There's just some other words there that you can use: metropolis, mechanisation. And there was a sense that the imposed system of synchronised time was forcing people into an order that they perhaps didn't find particularly organic. And this was true of home, school and work. And it's hard for us to imagine that before the Industrial Revolution, people would get up with the sunrise and they would go to bed with sundown. There was no electricity. And it was only after the Industrial Revolution that you started getting trains and buses that needed timetables, and it was during this period, maybe 100 years prior, where the proper measurement of time was only becoming standardised. Obviously pollution with all the factories and the sooty chimney sweeps and so forth, it was pretty nasty. And there was a sense that this was moving away from our humanity, that it was becoming pretty ugly in many ways. The French Revolution is an important historic backdrop to Romantic texts. It went from 1789 to 1799, it's about 10 years. And the main aim was to revolt against the extravagance of the monarchy and the privileged classes. Many Romantics sympathised with the ideals and the achievements of the French revolutionaries, who wanted liberty, freedom, fraternity and equality. It did, though, collapse, and it led to Napoleon's dictatorship, then the Napoleonic Wars, and this period is particularly important for those of you studying worlds of upheaval. There was a sense of disillusionment with many of the Romantics when the revolution failed. Some of the most important Romantic writers include William Blake. He's the earliest English Romantic writer. Of course, at the time they didn't refer to themselves as Romantic. We have imposed that title upon them after the event. Then you had Wordsworth and Coleridge. Those three are considered the first generation. Second generation include Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Shelley, his wife, who wrote Frankenstein, John Keats, Lord Byron, and then after the Romantic period had officially ended, you have people like the Bronte sisters, also Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, who have Romantic elements too. To the Romantics, there was no other value more important than nature. They saw nature as a teacher, a source of inspiration, and their reverence for it was religious. They would appreciate it as much as you might a god or a goddess, because the experiences one could have in nature were transcendent. They were those that would take you beyond this worldly realm and to the next level, higher. They were transportative experiences where you are taken away from the present moment. And so because of this, you get a lot of settings that are pastoral, that are rustic, quaint cottages, rural settings. And they were, of course, critical of urbanisation that was taking place in all the cities, and they valued time alone to be with nature. You weren't thought to be a weirdo if you needed time in nature. On the right-hand side there, it's a really lovely, famous example of Wordsworth adoring the beauty of the daffodils when he refers to how he wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on higher over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So the notion of the sublime is a very important romantic concept, and it's this idea that when we're immersed or set amidst a landscape or natural element that is immense and majestic, that we are reminded of our own insignificance because of the sheer weight of the waterfall or the power of the sea, and that in this process we can lose ourselves, get away from things and find a freedom. It's not only about the beauty and the scale, it's also about the awe and the terror that you might experience when you're, say, up against a huge, scary landscape like the person in that painting on screen, that you could easily be dead in just a minute. And it's this idea too that in having these experiences, we can move beyond the mundane and mechanical of the industrial world. The idea of artistic freedom was also very important to the Romantics. So, as opposed to being rational and reasoned and weighing everything and providing evidence for everything, they were more interested in the ideas and the emotion, the intuition, spontaneity, following the heart, and that self-expression was very, very important. It was paramount. As David Caspar Friedrich said, he's the Romantic painter that painted the image on the previous slide, the artist's feeling is law. And then, of course, Wordsworth famously said that poetry was the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So feelings, emotions, very, very important to the Romantics. And of course, originality. They believed that artistic genius was ex nihilo, which means from nothing. It just is a spontaneousness that's there for the artist. And the individual experience was very important too, highly valued. So there was a tendency to introspection, looking inwards, a valuing of the singularity, the uniqueness of our individual experiences. And that, of course, leads to subjectivity, the personal, spontaneity, as we said, intuition, following your heart, following your spidey senses, and passion. Can't underestimate the importance of passion to the Romantics, because strong feeling is where it's at for them. To the Romantics, the imagination was just as important as nature and emotion. They believed that the artist needed to follow their imaginative force rather than simply adhering to conventional rules about form. And they saw dreams and visions and those experiences in nature as a way to harness their imagination. On the right-hand side there, we've got Kubla Khan, or an extract from it by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Highly imaginative piece. He writes, "In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph, the sacred river, ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. So twice 5 miles of fertile ground with walls and towers were girdled round, and there were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree. and here were forests ancient as the hills, enfolding sunny spots of greenery. His imagination was also heavily powered with opium. But anyhow, the imagination was very important. It also makes sense that the Romantic period saw a new emphasis on childhood. They saw children as the source of humanity, as innocent and inseparable from nature, or most connected with nature, that they were imaginative and free from the constraints of, industrialized, mechanized cities in particular. William Wordsworth, over on the right, from this poem, My Heart Leaps Up, he says, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." The Romantics saw their emotions as offering an authentic source of an aesthetic experience. So they weren't trying to hurry up and get on with things. They actually indulged or went with their emotions. I thought it was an interesting modern perspective from Thought Co website. They said that they were often guided by irrational emotional impulses, which is probably right. When you read the Romantics, you can hear in them a tendency to be sort of overwrought. But love, passion, sympathy, awe, wonder and terror were very much emotional experiences that were acceptable. And yes, Frankenstein is certainly written in a way that is very emotional, overwrought at times. Given their tendency to strong emotion, it is unsurprising that the Romantics also experienced a lot of isolation and melancholy, which means deep, deep sadness. It was during this time that the idea of the tortured, misunderstood artist really came into being, particularly so with the German text called The Sorrows of Young Werther, which was written in 1774 and formed part of the German early Romantic movement known as Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress. So young Werther experiences a whole bunch of despair, and the whole thing is pretty devastating. It wasn't only characters though, the authors themselves experienced this kind of despair and depression. On the right hand side there, we can see Percy Shelley lamenting and taking on this sense of difficulty and grief when he wrote, "O world, O life, O time, on whose last steps I climb, trembling at that where I had stood before, when will return the glory of your prime? No more, O nevermore. Out of the day and night a joy has taken flight, fresh spring and summer and winter hoar, move my faint heart with grief, but with delight no more, oh never more." So a sense of total desolation, feeling bereft, separate, and unable to ever feel joy again. Pretty dark. So the Romantics were big on beauty, but not in the way we are today. It was a different sensibility. They loved beautiful things, beautiful nature, beautiful art, because of its ability to inspire in us passion, the way we feel captivated when we see something beautiful, and how it invokes in us an emotional response. It wasn't just a human's physicality, their beautiful face or their beautiful physique. It was art, it was garments, it was tapestries, it was anything that was beautiful. On the right is perhaps my favourite lines from any romantic poem by John Keats, Ode on a Gresham Urn, very, very famous. And he says, and it's true, no doubt, that beauty is truth and truth is beauty, and that is all ... ye need to know. The Romantics were also very interested in the supernatural, the mysterious, the occult, the vision or dreams, perhaps fragments, apparitions, ghosts. On the right-hand side there, you can see a little extract from Christabel, which is Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem set for extension 1. This is when Christabel has taken Geraldine, who seems to be an innocent damsel in distress at first in the forest, and she takes her home and gives her shelter for the night, but Geraldine starts to change in a way that's quite scary and otherworldly. He writes, "A snake's small eye blinks dull and shy, and the lady's eyes, they shrunk in her head, each shrunk up to a serpent's eye, and with somewhat of malice and more of dread, at Christabel she looked askance one moment, and the sight was fled." They were also interested in the exotic, so things that were different, unusual, intriguing, the other, foreign, sense of unreality, strangeness of different cultures. They were particularly interested in what they used to refer to as the Oriental or Orientalism. That was an interest in Eastern cultures as representations of the exotic, freedom from constraint, even sort of like a utopian world. And they were referring usually to India, the Middle East, and China. We can see this particularly in Kubla Khan. Because they were turning away from the progress of the Industrial Revolution, the Romantics harkened back to the Middle Ages as a nobler, simpler time. So they often were interested in heroics, chivalry, so knightly honour, and it has been said that they were perhaps myopic in viewing this time and forgot about the difficulties such as having no electricity, high mortality rates, and so forth. The Romantics tended to idealise women and depict them in a way that fit with this idea. They saw them as beautiful, innocent, naive, bundles of perfection, needing shelter and protection, and they held them up on a pedestal and worshipped them. On the right is an extract from Edgar Allan Poe's very famous Annabel Lee, and you can hear in the speaker's voice just how he revered and loved his deceased wife. He says, or writes rather, "For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea." The Year Without a Summer, which was actually 1816, is only really relevant for those of you studying Frankenstein in Worlds of Upheaval, and I would imagine Intersecting Worlds as well. So in 1815, the year before The Year Without the Summer, a volcanic eruption took place in Mount Tambora in Indonesia, and it still has set the record for the largest eruption in human history. The volcanic cloud lowered temperatures by 3 degrees, and even though it was closer to the southern hemisphere, it also affected the northern hemisphere, so it was huge. Crops failed in Europe, livestock died, and this came to create a sense of dread and doom and what can happen when nature is fed up and goes awry. Lord Byron wrote a poem inspired by this darkness and imagined what would life be like if We were forever in the dark, and it's a great poem actually. He says, I had a dream, which was not all a dream. The bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander, darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. So it was during that year without the summer that Frankenstein was conceived. It's an interesting story where you had the Via Diodati at Lake Geneva, where Byron, Mary and Percy Shelley, those two were married, were sitting around unable to go out because of the darkness. So they were trying to come up with horror stories, and they were all writers, literary people. And it was one of these nights that Mary Shelley dreamt up this terrifying idea of what would happen if somebody animated corpse pieces. Some say Frankenstein represents the clash between the Enlightenment, because Victor Frankenstein is completely obsessed with scientific advancement, his project, and the romantic in the monster's emotional and very sad longing for love and companionship and acknowledgement. Romantics wrote in many forms, but they had a particular love for poetry. In 1802, Wordsworth was questioning and then answering, what is a poet? And he said that he is somebody who is endowed with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. He'd probably be cancelled these days for being exclusive and not inclusive, but there's this sense that the poet was special, visionary, sensitive, etc. Shelley also said in his A Defence of Poetry that poets were the unacknowledged legislators of the world, the lawmakers, so exalting the poet and their role in society. Yes, when you're making links to context, we do want you to be referring to the beliefs, the values, the attitudes that shaped the text. But it's also perfectly acceptable here and there to reference the form. For example, you could write, in line with the Romantics' love of the freedom and accessibility of the poetic form, ... Still shows an understanding of the period. Generally speaking, to recap, the Romantics were moving away from the rational towards the emotional, away from scientific advancements and more towards the imagination, away from evidence to intuition, gut instinct, feelings, away from sensible and reasoned judgment and more towards passion, away from cities and towards nature and country cottages, away from highfalutin, complex language, particularly in poetry, to a simpler, more accessible language so that everybody could understand it. They often moved away from England and saw that as the familiar, where the constraints and conventions were holding them back, and towards the exotic in terms of location and settings and experiences. Rather than seeing adulthood as the most rational and important moment of a person's life, they instead exalted the child and saw childhood as something very, very special to be protected. And they moved away from the present and all the change that was happening there, the progress that was going on, and often hearkened back to the medieval period because they saw this as a nobler time. Some of the features you will find in Romantic texts, and it's a good idea to actually go through and find these in your prescribed texts, include an expressive, passionate, and exclamatory tone. Highly descriptive prose. Some people find that irritating. I like it. A lot of natural landscapes, of course, that have a scale and an immensity to them, where they almost become their own character. Common everyday people as characters. An interiority, that means a focus on the character's inner thoughts and feelings, emotions. Everyday diction, so that the language is accessible to your average person, whereas poetry prior to that had been a bit highfalutin, a bit exclusive, and still is today in many ways. An emphasis too on conversational poetry, so blank verse at times, that's intimate, personal, and often biographical, but there's also a lot of rhythm and cadence, as you can tell from the poems that we've read here today. They personify a lot of the nature, like Wordsworth daffodils. A lot of pathetic fallacy, where the natural elements, like the weather, take on the human emotions and behaviour that makes sense. Quaint, rural and domestic settings, and supernatural and mysterious elements, and references to the Oriental, as in India, the Middle East, or China. It's sometimes quite alluring when we're studying to sit and passively take notes, but you won't get the most out of this lesson until you actually apply the knowledge to the texts. If you're aiming for a band 6, you would be trying to include contextual references in every paragraph, in the topic sentence preferably, and there are 2 worksheets that are currently free for you to download and use to help you do this. If you'd like more HSC English resources, or you're interested in attending a holiday workshop or a seminar or even a webinar, please head to the website www.allgoodeducationalresources.com.au. Our aim is to help you get a band 6 in English, and all of the resources include answers and force active learning. I hope this has been helpful, and thank you for listening. If you'd like more depth and detail on the Romantic period, please feel free to find your way to The Romantics, the BBC documentary that's split up into 3 sections: Nature, Liberty and Eternity. It's very interesting, and I think you'll get a lot out of it.